Nobody was supposed to know it existed. Not the neighbors. Not the mechanics who worked 3 streets over. Not even his own wife, for the first 11 years of their marriage. A 426 Hemi, born in 1970, wrapped in a color so rare that Chrysler only painted 11 cars this way, sat under a canvas tarp in a cinderblock garage behind a house in a town so small it doesn't have a stoplight. For 40 years, a man named Walter Denny opened that garage door only at night, only alone, and only long enough to run a rag over the hood before locking it back up and walking away like nothing was there. His own son didn't learn the truth until the day they read his father's will, and what he found underneath that tarp would turn a quiet Midwestern funeral into one of the strangest automotive discoveries of the decade. But to understand why a man would hide the most powerful engine Detroit ever built for 4 straight decades, you have to go back to a summer night in 1971, to a race that never should have happened, and to a decision that would haunt Walter Denny for the rest of his life. Walter grew up the son of a machinist in a factory town where everybody's father worked the same 3 shifts, and everybody's mother stretched the same grocery budget. He was quiet, the kind of quiet that made teachers forget he was in the room. But underneath that silence was a kid who could look at an engine block and understand it the way other people understood a book. By 14, he was rebuilding lawnmower engines for beer money. By 16, he was sneaking into the junkyard after school to strip parts off wrecked Mopars, teaching himself compression ratios and cam timing from library books, because nobody in his family had ever owned anything with more than 6 cylinders. His best friend, a wiry kid named Ray Kessler, used to say Walter didn't talk much because he was always doing the math in his head. Horsepower math. Quarter-mile math. The kind of math that got you killed if you got it wrong on the wrong stretch of road. To really understand why this car mattered so much to Walter, you have to understand what the 426 Hemi actually was in 1970, because this wasn't just another muscle car option on a build sheet. Chrysler's engineers had built the Hemi years earlier purely for racing, a motor so dominant on the NASCAR circuit and the drag strip that other manufacturers begged for it to be banned. The public demand got so loud that Chrysler finally agreed to sell a street version, and even then it was never meant for casual drivers. It cost nearly $800 over the base price of the car, an enormous sum in 1970, and dealers only sold a handful to customers who actually understood what they were buying. Anybody who ordered one knew exactly what it was for. It wasn't for commuting. It wasn't for family road trips. It was for racing, plain and simple. And everyone who saw one on the street understood the unspoken challenge that came bolted under that hood. Ray remembers one afternoon in particular, the 2 of them maybe 15 years old, lying underneath a rusted-out Plymouth on cinder blocks in Walter's backyard, when Walter said something Ray never forgot. He said someday he was going to own a car so fast that people would stop talking the moment it pulled up. Not because it was loud, not because it was flashy, but because everybody would just know, the second they heard that engine idle, that they were looking at something serious. Ray laughed it off at the time. Kids said things like that all the time in a town where the biggest excitement most weekends was a high school football game. But Walter wasn't joking. And if you stick with this story, you'll understand just how literally he meant it. By 1969, Walter was 22 and working the line at a parts supplier, saving every dollar for one thing. He didn't want a nice car. He didn't want a reliable car. He wanted the baddest, meanest, most uncompromising machine. Detroit was legally allowed to sell to a civilian, and in 1970 there was only one answer to that question, the 426 Hemi. 2 4-barrel carburetors, a hemispherical combustion chamber that let the engine breathe like nothing else on the road, 425 horsepower on paper, and everybody who actually owned one knew the real number was closer to 480 once you leaned on it. It cost him almost everything he had saved, plus a loan from an uncle who thought he'd lost his mind. But in the spring of 1970, Walter Denny drove off a dealer lot in a car that could out-accelerate anything else built that decade, and for one golden summer, that car made him a legend on every back road in 3 counties. He never lost. Not once. Guys came from towns 45 minutes away just to get beaten by him, because losing to Walter Denny in that Hemi had become its own strange badge of honor. Farm boys with souped-up Novas, rich kids with brand-new Corvettes their fathers bought them, veteran racers who'd been running the same stretch of county road since before Walter could drive. One by one, he put them all in his rearview mirror. Word got around. People started calling him the Reaper, because once you lined up next to him at that stop sign on Route 9, you already knew how the story ended. And then came the night that changed everything. The night Walter Denny never talked about again for the rest of his life. It was late August 1971, a Friday night thick with humidity. The kind of night where every kid in the county who owned anything with a carburetor showed up on Route 9 because word had spread that a stranger from 2 towns over was coming to challenge the Reaper. Cars lined both shoulders of the road for almost half a mile, headlights off, engines ticking as they cooled, everyone waiting in that particular kind of electric silence that only exists right before something big is about to happen. Someone had brought a cooler of beer. Nobody was old enough to buy legally. Someone else had a transistor radio playing low in the background. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise and nervous energy, Walter sat behind the wheel of his Hemi, engine idling with that low, uneven lope that only a solid lift or big block makes, staring straight ahead down the dark stretch of road he'd already memorized 100 times over. Nobody remembers the stranger's name anymore. What they remember is that he had a black Chevelle, built tight, sounding meaner than anything Walter had lined up against all summer. What they remember is the flagman dropping his arm, two cars launching off the line so hard the asphalt seemed to shake, and Walter's Hemi pulling ahead by half a car length before the quarter-mile marker. And what they remember, what nobody who was there that night has ever fully forgotten, is what happened at the very end of that race, in the dark, past the finish line, where the road curved and the streetlights ran out. If you're expecting me to tell you right now exactly what happened on that curve, I'm not going to. Not yet. Because what happened after that night matters just as much as what happened during it, and you need to understand both halves before any of this makes sense. And trust me, the answer is not what most people guess. Every single person I've told this story to has assumed one of two things, and both of them are wrong. What I can tell you is this: Walter Denny won that race, and he never raced again. Not once. Not ever. The very next morning, before the sun was even fully up, neighbors say they saw him back that Hemi into his garage, and they didn't see it come back out for 40 years. Ray Kessler, his best friend since grade school, tried for months to get him to talk about it. Walter wouldn't say a word. He quit hanging around the garage where the racing crowd used to gather. He stopped answering when people brought up Route 9. Within a year, he'd married a local girl named Carol, taken a steady job at the plant, and by every outward appearance become exactly the kind of unremarkable, hard-working, small-town man that nobody would ever suspect of having once been a legend. Carol didn't even know about the car until they'd been married over a decade, and even then, all Walter told her was that it was parked, and that it wasn't up for discussion. Not sold. Not scrapped. Parked. As if the car itself were serving some kind of sentence. Here's where the story could have simply ended. A man quits racing, buries a piece of his past, lives out an ordinary life. That's the version most people would expect. But it's not what happened, and this is where things start to get strange. Because Walter Denny didn't just park that Hemi and forget about it. He maintained it. Obsessively. Every single year, without fail, in the dead of night when nobody else was awake, neighbors would occasionally catch the low, unmistakable rumble of a big block engine turning over somewhere behind his property, running for exactly a few minutes before going silent again. Some of them assumed it was just an old generator. A few of the older folks on the block eventually figured out what it really was, but out of respect, or maybe just small-town discretion, nobody ever said a word about it to Walter directly. He changed the oil on a schedule. He kept the battery charged, swapping it out for a fresh one every few years long before the old one could ever die. He replaced belts and hoses before they ever had the chance to fail, ordering obscure, discontinued parts through the mail from suppliers 3 states away, always paying in cash, always giving a fake name when the parts store called to confirm the order. For 40 years, Walter Denny kept a car alive that, as far as the rest of the world was concerned, didn't exist, and he never once drove it past the end of his own driveway. Why would a man do that? Why maintain a machine you refuse to use, hide from your own family, and clearly associate with something painful enough that you can't even speak its name? That question sat unanswered for 4 decades, and it's the question that his son, Daniel, inherited the day his father passed away in the winter of 2011. Daniel Denny was 38 years old when he got the call. He'd grown up hearing vague rumors, an uncle mentioning once at Thanksgiving that your old man used to be something else behind the wheel. A comment quickly shut down by his mother before Daniel could ask a single follow-up question. He'd always assumed it was small-town legend, exaggeration, the kind of story that grows bigger every time it's retold at a bar. He had no idea, walking into that cinder-block garage with the estate lawyer 3 days after the funeral, that he was about to pull a canvas tarp off the single most valuable piece of his father's entire life. The tarp was heavier than he expected, stiff with decades of dust, and when it finally slid free, Daniel says he just stood there in silence for almost a full minute. The garage was cold, the kind of cold that settles into concrete and never really leaves, and the only light came from a single bare bulb hanging from a wire, swinging slightly from the draft of the door he'd just opened. Underneath was a triple black 1970 Hemi. Paint so deep it looked wet even under a dying flashlight. Chrome that hadn't seen sunlight in longer than Daniel had been alive, and a smell. That specific smell of old vinyl and gasoline and cold metal that hit him harder than he expected it to. He ran his hand along the hood, through 40 years of dust, and underneath his palm he could still feel the shape of the scoop, still feel just how much car this actually was. Sitting on the passenger seat, folded with almost ceremonial precision, was a single piece of paper. A newspaper clipping. Yellowed, brittle at the edges, dated late August 1971. And this is the part of the story where everything Daniel thought he understood about his quiet, unremarkable father completely fell apart, because that clipping wasn't about a race. It was an obituary. The stranger from that night, the driver of the black Chevelle, hadn't simply lost the race and gone home. Somewhere past the finish line, on that dark curve where the streetlights ran out, his car had left the road. He didn't survive the night. And Walter Denny, 23 years old and already carrying more guilt than any young man should have to hold, had spent the following 40 years believing, rightly or wrongly, that his own hunger to win, his own refusal to back down from one more race on one more summer night, had cost another man his life. He never raced again because he couldn't bring himself to. He never sold the car because getting rid of it felt like erasing the one piece of evidence that this had actually happened, that a person had actually died, that Walter owed it to him to remember. And he never drove it, not even once, not even down his own quiet street, because in his mind, the moment that Hemi's tires touched pavement again, he'd be right back on Route 9 in the summer of 1971, and he wasn't sure he could survive that a second time. Think about that for a second. A man who spent his entire adult life within arm's reach of the single fastest, most powerful machine in his own possession, and who never once let himself enjoy it, not for one single mile, because he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve to. That's not just grief. That's a man sentencing himself to a punishment nobody else even knew he was serving. Daniel sat in that garage for hours that first night, reading and rereading the clipping, piecing together decades of his father's silence, one sentence at a time. He called Ray Kessler the next morning, the same childhood friend his father had frozen out all those years ago, and Ray finally told him the rest of it. How Walter had shown up at the funeral of that stranger, a young man from 2 towns over that nobody in their circle had really known, and stood quietly in the back where the family wouldn't recognize him, and left an envelope of cash with the funeral home that he never once mentioned again. Ray had kept that secret for 40 years because Walter had asked him to, and because some promises, once you make them to your best friend, you just keep. For weeks after the funeral, Daniel couldn't decide what to do with the car. Part of him wanted to sell it immediately, to be rid of the weight his father had carried for 4 decades. Part of him couldn't stop thinking about the discipline it must have taken to keep a machine like that alive, untouched, for 40 years, purely out of guilt and grief and love. In the end, it was Carol, Daniel's mother, who told him what she believed Walter would have actually wanted. She said that Walter never once regretted owning that car. What he regretted was who he'd been the night he raced it that last time. The car itself, she said, was innocent. It was just steel and fire. What mattered was what a person chose to do with it. So Daniel made a decision. He wasn't going to sell it, and he wasn't going to leave it buried in that garage for another 40 years either. He had the Hemi gently, carefully brought back to running condition, not restored to showroom perfection, but preserved exactly as his father had kept it. Right down to the same tires that had sat there since the Ford administration. Tires that were more historical artifact than functional rubber at that point. The mechanic he hired, an older man who'd spent his whole career on classic Mopars, told Daniel flat out that he'd never seen a 40-year-old engine in this kind of condition, and he said it in a tone that made it clear he wasn't exaggerating. Fresh fuel, new plugs, a rebuilt fuel pump, and they were ready to turn the key. Everyone standing in that garage that afternoon knew there was a real chance it simply wouldn't start. That 40 years of stillness might have finally beaten what 40 years of guilt never could. And when it finally turned over for the first time in 4 decades, in front of Ray Kessler and a small handful of people who remembered the Reaper from back when Route 9 still had a reputation, more than one grown man standing in that driveway had to wipe his eyes. Daniel didn't take it racing. He never will. Instead, he reached out to the family of the young man who died that night in 1971, a family he'd never met, carrying a story he never expected to be the one telling. It took months to track them down, and when he finally did, he didn't know what to expect. Anger, rejection, the door slammed in his face. He drove 3 hours to meet her in person rather than explain something this heavy over the phone, and he sat in his car outside her house for almost 20 minutes before he found the nerve to knock. What he got instead was something closer to relief. The stranger's younger sister, now in her 60s, told Daniel that her family had spent decades believing her brother's death was simply a reckless accident, a boy driving too fast on a dark road, and nothing more. She had no idea there had even been a race that night, no idea another driver existed, and certainly no idea that a total stranger had quietly paid for her brother's funeral and then spent the rest of his life punishing himself for a choice made in half a second on a summer road. She sat with that information for a long moment, Daniel says, and then she asked him one question he never forgot. Did your father ever get to feel forgiven? Daniel didn't have an answer for her, and honestly, he still doesn't. It didn't undo the loss. Nothing could. But it gave her family a piece of the story they'd never had, and, in a strange way, it gave Walter Denny's silence a kind of meaning it had never publicly carried before. Today, that 426 Hemi still sits in the same cinderblock garage where it spent 40 years hidden from the world, except now the door stays open sometimes, and neighbors who once only heard rumors about the Reaper get to actually see the car that built the legend. Daniel starts it once a month, just like his father did, letting it run for a few minutes before shutting it back down, not because he's hiding it anymore, but because some rituals, once you understand where they came from, become sacred instead of strange. He says he doesn't drive it far. He doesn't need to. For him, the car was never really about speed. It was about understanding, 40 years too late, the difference between the story a quiet man tells the world and the one he actually carries inside himself. And maybe that's the real reason this story has stuck with everyone who's heard it since Daniel first shared it. Because underneath the chrome, the horsepower, and the mystery of a garage door that stayed shut for 4 decades, this was never really a story about a car at all. It was about a man who made one choice on one night when he was young, and who spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of forgiveness he never asked anyone to give him. And here's the part that I think about the most, the part that changes how you hear everything that came before it. Walter Denny didn't hide that car because he was ashamed of it. He hid it because he loved it too much to let himself enjoy it while another family was living without someone they loved. That's not the story most people expect when they hear the words hidden Hemi. Most people expect a treasure hunt. What they get instead is one of the most quietly devastating stories about guilt, love, and 40 years of self-punishment that most of us will ever hear. Somewhere out there, in small towns you've probably never heard of, there are other garages just like Walter Denny's. Other cars sitting quietly under old tarps, other stories nobody has found yet, waiting for someone to finally lift the cover and ask the one question that matters more than any horsepower number ever could. What really happened? And why did somebody feel like they had to hide it for so long? If a story like this one is sitting in your own family, in a barn, in a garage, in a box of old photographs, nobody's opened in years, don't wait 40 years to find out what it means. Some legends only survive because somebody, eventually, was brave enough to lift the tarp.